Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a review for one of the weekend projects, a little bit of a different format here. I'm sitting here with one of my students, Jordan, and so he's going to have some questions. Say
Great.
hello.
Hi. So are we starting from scratch?
We're going to start from scratch. So this is what we're going to end up building, and we could maybe sort of tease it apart a little bit, figure out exactly, what we're doing here. But in essence, we've got data that we're just storing within our application. We have no real database layer or anything like that. And we've got 2 pages in our app. And we can go in here and we can drill down to a category. And we can, end up adding products here. And we can delete products. We could end up adding another category, so we could say, school supplies. Now we've got a new category. Notice that it ends up taking us to this page. We also see on the right here that we could see what our data structure is. So this is kind of important. If we look at the data structure for this application, we've got a collection of categories, and each category will have a collection of products or no products at all. Right, so right now we have school supplies, we have no products. We could add a pencil, and we'll see here on the right that that pencil will end up getting added. So let's start to think about how we would go about setting this up. I mean, one thing really right off the bat that it's pretty obvious we're going to need is we're going to need our server. And this should not really be a ton of code that we're going to be looking at. Our server is going to be pretty light. We're going to have several different routes that are here. So we're going to have our home route, obviously, which is just some, nothing really when we build it. But again, just to show that we can have multiple pages in our app, we'll end up moving to our categories. And again, we don't have to necessarily worry about, we could sort of keep it simple. We don't have to get bogged down with the styling of it. Let's just sort of focus on what the functionality is going to be here. So if we sort of think about looking at what these different routes are, right? Sometimes starting with the get routes is a little bit easier. We have a get route for categories, and if we end up going to the categories, we'll see that these are going to list our categories, okay? We've also got a get route, which gives us a particular category, which is a drill down. And so if we end up clicking on a category, that's going to be the same route plus an ID, and this will give us our categories themselves. So let's go back here and let's start thinking about how we could code this. Again, if we get the structure of the Express app, and we sort of get even some placeholders for our routes. I mean, the nice thing about this app is that we don't have a lot of views. I mean, if we look at what our views are for our application, we really only have 2 routes. We've got our get route for our categories and our get route for our category details. I really should say 3 routes because we have our home page as well. And we're going to use a templating engine so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, every time we go through there.
Right.
Does that make sense so far?
Well, let me try to repeat if I understand this right. So we are creating a route for a home page, a route for a categories page.
Sure. And let's call it, the route itself is going to be /categories, but that's going to be a listing of all the categories.
Okay.
And that's sort of like the RESTful pattern is to say /categories, which returns all of the categories, as opposed to /categories with an ID,
sure,
which will return one category, in which case
we don't even need that.
Well,
we do that because they list the products. Okay.
That's exactly right. Right. If we didn't have the list of products, it really wouldn't matter all that much.
Okay, so we have a route for a home page with its own template. Oh, not even. Well, yeah, we do. Layout. Okay.
Yeah, so
its own template. Categories with its own template. I think products will have probably the same template as categories.
Yeah, we could maybe name these differently, but the categories one is going to show. Also, if you look at these 3 pages, which are templates, the layout's going to be used for all of them.
Sure.
The index is going to be our home page. We could have
Correct.
called it home if we wanted to. Categories is going to be our list, and category is really going to be the category
Okay.
with its products.
That's a good point. So it's really one template.
It's really one
One layout.
and 3 templates corresponding to 3 different routes,
Which are almost the same.
which are going to be very similar.
All right. So there's that, and then we're creating. Okay, so get categories ID.
And also we have a get slash for the home page.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And let's not worry for now.
Okay.
Let's not even be concerned at all about the inserting and the updating and the deleting.
Yeah.
Let's start out with some data
Okay.
so we don't have to worry about that. Because I think what people get trapped with is that the problem is it's like, well, what are you going to build first? Well, it's great if you could build your listing pages first because those are the easiest things. Getting data is usually a lot easier than inserting
Sure.
or deleting data.
Yeah.
So if you start out with some data, it's going to make your life easier, and then you could think about the other routes that you're going to put in. Once we end up getting some data in there, again, it's fake to begin with because we're just sort of storing this in memory, but we'll start out with a couple of categories and some products. So let's open this up. And I've got this empty directory here, and I'm going to do an npm init. Y is going to give me my package JSON file. And just for good measure, I'll just say git init. So I've got a git repo here as well. So again, I don't have all that much that's here. What I'm going to end up doing here, there's a couple of things that I need right off the bat. I'm going to need to have Express. And do I need anything else? I'm just going to start out with Express, okay? And I'm going to save this, so this goes in my package JSON file. And I'm going to open up my editor of choice. And so one thing that I want to do here is that I want to sort of start my application. So what I like to do is, in my development environment, I do a start dev. And the reason why I do this is that when you deploy your site, npm will automatically comes with a default start, which will actually look for a server.js file. It sort of comes along for the ride.
Okay.
So this is basically just for me when I'm developing my application, because when I'm developing my app, whenever I make a change, I want to rerun it.
Sure.
So I'm going to call nodemon server.js. Now again, this doesn't exist, but I'm going to go over here. So again, we wrote one line of code. Right. So but even if I don't do that, I could say npm run, and if I forgot what I called that, I could just say npm run, and I could see that I've got my start dev. Okay.
Right.
So I could say npm run start dev, and it'll say, all right, I'm watching, and I can't find the server.js, which I expect it can because I don't have it. And you're right. I could just have done a touch, but I could also just go over here and say server.js. And
where did you just go? Just done. Where did you go to write server.js?
oh, so this is just my my IDE allows me to add files here.
Oh,
so
got
this
it.
is my shortcuts.
Cool.
So if I go over here and I start to add this, well, what do we need for an Express app? All right, again, we can do this really sort of first of all, one thing we want to do here is we want to come over here. If we're running locally, we're going to want to have a local host, and we'll say that our port's going to be 3000. This doesn't exist yet. So it's not surprising that we get this error here. There's really nothing that would make this work. What we're going to do here is now we're going to create our Express app, and we're going to do that by requiring Express. And the only thing, bare bones minimum, that we need is an app. Well, 2 things, I should say. App equals Express. Now I've got an Express app, and I've got to start my server. So in order to start my server, I could just do this app.listen and say 3000. But that's not great because when I deploy it, I'm not going to have that port. That's going to be set up for me. So what I like to do is to actually say something like port equals process environment port. Now again, this might seem like it's being pulled out of thin air, but all of the places where you'd end up deploying your site, they would set this port for you.
Yeah.
And so this will work. And I could say, hey, look, if this is not being supplied, use 3000. And now I could say app.listen port. And over here, I could say console.log, and I could use this backtick syntax and say listening on port.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So now, if that, assuming that that ends up running, what I should see now is if I go to run this, it'll give me an error that says I can't make that GET request. Okay? So let's start out by doing our home page, and we'll go over here and we'll say app.get, and we'll say request, response, next, and just to sort of see that I get something here, let me say response.send hello world. All right, just to see that we have something. And we've got hello world, right? And just for the sake of argument, let's just pretend that we're setting this up for our other routes as well. We could go over here and say categories, and I'll say hello categories. And I'm going to go over here, and I'm actually even going to do this route. So this is one where we're going to have a placeholder for the ID, right? So I do that with a colon, and I'll say hello category, and let's use our backtick syntax here. We'll say hello, not categories, but category, and we'll put over here request.params.id. That's how you end up getting at that value, and we'll replace this with a backtick, and just give ourselves a little bit more room to work. So assuming that I've got everything lined up here, this should still work. We should be able to go to categories. We should be able to go to categories 1. And the point that I want to make here is that just sort of notice in terms of building this, not a lot of code, which is fine, but we didn't have to write every time that we're making changes, doing one line at a time, right? Not going in and writing a lot of code in order to get to this stage. Now, we really want to use some kind of, it would be nice if we had some sort of templating engine. So we could actually, pass in some categories and products and this sort of thing. So let's fake things a little bit. What I'm going to do over here is I'm going to say and I'm just going to call this my data. And we'll go over here and we're going to put in 2 categories. So I'm going to say I've got...
How did you get from templating engines to this? What was your thought process?
I didn't. I started to think about that. I want to have some data.
Okay.
Let's take a step back. Maybe you're right. Let's go back. Let's go to templating engines first, then we'll come back to this. Good point.
All right.
So when we go to do a templating engine, instead of saying response.send, let's go over here and we're going to say response.render. And we could call this whatever we want to. I called for it being called index.html. If we go and do this, and I go back, these will still work fine, by the way.
Okay.
But if I go back here, because I'm using that render, it says, hey, you can't do that because there's no view engine that we've specified. So I'm going to go and I'm going to use the Swig view engine here. I can actually just open up another terminal here and say npm install Swig. So this is now the templating engine that we're going to use. Now we have access to Swig, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to have to bring it in here by saying Swig require Swig. Now one thing I like to do reflexively, almost right off the bat, is to say Swig set defaults. Cache
true.
False. Right? I don't want to cache in these things. If it does,
true.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's what I'm doing, right? I don't want to cache these pages. If you forget to do this, you'll just realize that when you update your templates, you'll end up seeing the old templates. Now, this is not going to set up the templating engine yet. In order to do that, I've got to tell my app that I want to set the view engine, okay? And what this says is that what extension do you want to look for? When you say render index, what extension do you want in terms of finding that template? Well, I want you to look for HTML. Okay? But when I do that, it's actually also going to look for an engine for HTML. So if I just did this, I could get away with just doing this, and then what will happen, I'll get a different error message. And this will say, hey, look, I'm looking for an HTML file, but I don't know how to process this. You haven't told me, okay? And this is where the swig comes in to say app, and we end up saying engine. For the HTML engine, we're going to use swig render file. And this basically is now going to be using swig as our templating engine. So when we call index, it's going to look for an index.html file, and we could pass some data, and we could use that data in the file. So if I do that, I'll get a different error message. And here it's saying, by default, it looks in the views directory, and it doesn't find that. Okay?
Because nothing's there yet.
Nothing's there. So again, taking this thing one step at a time, you're right, let's get our templating set up a little bit. We're going to add our views, and then I'm going to add my index.html, and I'll go over here and I'll say hello world, and now I'll be back in business. Now, let's start off by just by doing this page, and what we'll do here is we'll do HTML, and I'm not even going to bring in
Layout.
Bootstrap or anything.
Okay.
Let's just keep it simple. Because again, it's not necessarily anything that we need for this. But I'm going to go over here and just to see that our templating engine is working. This is swig syntax that's going to look for a variable called foo being passed in here that's not being passed. It's not going to give me an error, but it's just not going to give me anything. Okay? If I want to see that works, I could go back to my server, and when I go to render my index, there's a second parameter that I could pass. In terms of a templating engine, these are called locals. They get passed as locals to the templating engine, and if I say foo and bar, now I'll see bar will show up. So if I go back here, let's just sort of think about our initial layout, what we might want to do. Let's just say I'm going to put an H1 here that says home, and I'm going to put an unordered list in, just to sort of keep things kind of simple. And this is going to be a href slash home.
Yeah.
And I'll go over here. And so what this should end up giving me, nothing earth-shattering, but every time I click on this link, I'll just come back to this page. And let's also go over here, and we'll do another one. And this will be categories, right? So we'll go here. And if we click on categories, we'll go back to that page that we had. Here we're not using our templating engine. So let's sort of fake this a little bit. And we'll go back with our server. And when we go to render our categories, let's do a render. And we'll look for a page called categories.html. Okay? And if we end up doing that, and I reload this page, it'll tell me that it can't find that page. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to copy this. I'll call it categories.html, and I'll make one change so we can see the difference. And I'll call this categories. Okay? Now this is fine, and it gives us a little bit of functionality with our Express app, but it's very redundant, right? We've got this navigation on both pages. So what we can do is Swig gives us the ability to add a layout.html.
Yeah.
And what I could end up doing here is if I go to my index page, I could take all this stuff over here, and I'll go to my layout, and I'll paste this in. So now this is going to be my layout, and there's a couple things that I could do here. One thing we could do is instead of hard coding this, we could pass in a title, page title, and we could come down over here and we want to put some, if we just ended up doing this, okay? We just ended up doing this, and I'm going to go back to my categories, and instead of having this in here, I'm going to use Swig and say extends /layout.html. And I'm going to do the same thing for my index. So again, I'm going to take this out, and I'm going to say this too extends dot slash layout dot html. Okay, so now if I go back here, I should be in the same, pretty much the same boat, with the exception of not having any title. But if I went back over here to my server, instead of passing foo here, I'm going to pass a title. I'll call this home. And for categories, I'll pass a title, which is, again, this sort of local objects. And I'll go in here, and this is going to be categories. So now I've got home here, and I've got categories here. Okay? They're partially there, but we got a little bit of a problem. And the problem is that we have no way, no matter what we put here, it's never going to end up showing up. And the reason why it won't show up is that once you end up using a layout, if you want to put content on there, what you have to do is basically say where it's supposed to flow. Where's that content going to flow? And so here I could go over here and say block, and I could call this whatever I want to. I usually call it block content. And with Swig, when you start a tag, you have to end it, end block. By the way, I could put something in here if I want to. If I did that,
it'd be
in every page, that's right. So if I went over here, I'm on home, and on categories it says home too, which is not what I want. So one thing I could do, if I go to my categories page, and I actually specify, hey, look, here's the block for content, and it's really the same syntax. Now, the home page doesn't have the block, so it'll end up using what's here. The categories page has that block, and it'll end up using this. So here's categories, and here's home. Okay? So, I mean, right now, what we have, again, without the views and all that, we do have this sort of basic structure.
Yeah.
Now, let's go in and put in a little bit of data.
Yeah.
And the way that we'll end up doing that is that we'll start off by putting this in one file. We could always end up breaking it out. So what I'm going to do somewhere over here is I'll say let data equal. And
I have a question before you
go
get
ahead.
there. So right here, app.set view engine HTML is the whole purpose of that HTML, just so that you don't have to type .html next to index and categories?
Well, it will look for, so when you end up doing render, and again, I'm not an expert on the Swig templating engine, but it will tell it what, it'll do two things. I mean, it'll find what extension it'll put on there. I imagine you could put your own extension on there anyway, but it's also saying that it seems a little bit redundant. My understanding is that this will tell you what the extension is, okay, when you say render. But then once you end up doing that, it actually is looking for an engine for HTML. So the way that I think about it is this line tells the extension, but that's not enough. You also have to say, given that extension, what's going to be doing the processing.
Oh, okay.
Seems a little bit redundant.
Okay, so you put HTML there so that app.engine HTML makes sense.
They're
relying on each other.
Yeah, if I went over here and put another extension, and there are other engines. There's the engine called Jade and Pug and Hamel, and you could use those. Then I would have to define those engines.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's put some data here.
Yeah.
We're gonna, again, eventually we're gonna do this so that we'll actually have a little bit of a data layer. But I'm gonna go and give this an ID of 1, and I'll give this a name of sports. And for my products here, I'm going to have I'll give it one product. So I'm going to have a product. I'll give this an ID. This could be anything, but I'll give it an ID of 1, and I'll give it a name. So we'll have a tennis racket, And we'll go over here, and I'll replicate this, and we'll also have an ID of 2, and we'll say golf club. Now, one thing that you see with this is that I want to actually show the number of categories. And in fact, I do have one category here, but I'm not sending the data back. So not only am I going to send the title back for this, but I'm also going to go over here and I'm going to specify category, categories, and this is going to be my data. And I'll go over here, categories, and this is going to be my data. What this is going to allow me to do, and it's nice that I have this, let's just make sure this didn't break anything, which it didn't. But let's now go back to our template and our layout, and let's just go over here and we'll put in a categories dot length. So now we'll see that we have one category. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just put in another one that doesn't have any products. So we'll go over here, and this will be, we'll make this an ID of, again, we could be totally arbitrary. We'll give it an ID of 3, and we'll give this a name, and this is going to be
games.
Yeah, games. Okay, good, games. Okay. And we'll go over here and we'll say this is not going to have any products, so we'll say products is equal to this empty array. Okay. So now we've got 2 categories, and now since we end up having categories, let's now go to this categories page, and let's just do a little bit of swig to loop over the categories. So we'll go over here and we'll say for category in categories, end for. And so what we want to do is we want to repeat the category. Now, if we just do this, not surprisingly, what will end up happening here, and we could also, since this is a block, just to maybe indent it a little bit. Okay. If we go over here, we'll see that these are just objects. We actually want to see the data. Swig and a lot of these templating engines say, well, what do you want to do? We can just say JSON. Oh. And now it'll show us those individual categories. Now, the only thing we really want to do here is we want the name. So now we've got our 2 categories, and let's actually put this, again, we'll keep it simple. We'll put this in an unordered list. And so now there's a little room between them. And let's also just go one step further. Let's make this a link so we could sort of drill down into that category. See, it's much easier if we actually start out with a little bit of data because we don't have to worry about how we're getting the data in the system. Yeah. Don't have to worry about our insert methods and our delete methods. Again, we'll eventually end up getting there. And again, the other thing that I can't stress enough is the idea that really at this stage of the game, when you're creating something from scratch like this, you're in control of this. So look, you have the ability to write as many lines of code as you want before you go in and refresh that browser. But you might as well do the minimum amount because it's just going to make it less likely that you're going to end up running into different errors, right? So again, I mean, initially, can you loop over the categories? You don't get an error, and then you do the category name, and then if you go down here, you could put an href, and this is going to be categories, and right in here, and it's very important to also notice that these swig is happening on the server. What ends up getting returned to the client, you're not going to see those braces. You're going to get just regular HTML, and here we could say category .id. And that page actually will work, but it won't give us the data that we want because we created that page before. So if we go back here, now these are clickable, and we go back to this page, and we're seeing it's getting the right value for the ID, but how do we really want that to work? So let's go back in and let's create a category page, and instead of passing this back, we're going to say response.render, and this is going to be singular category. And we're also going to, we still want that number to show up on the top with our total categories. So we'll say categories still is equal to data. Now again, when we go to, we can anticipate what the error is going to be here, in that we don't have this category page.
Yeah.
But we'll go back in and we'll add a category. And again, it doesn't hurt to sort of get used to the syntax. Extends / layout.html. And we'll do a block here. We could actually have even left this out and come back to this and reload it. But again, minimal amount of code at a time just to make that error go away.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we want to get an individual category. So let's go over here and we'll say, we'll be somewhat, what's it called, optimistic, and let's pretend that we're actually looking for a category.name, which we don't have yet.
Okay.
Doesn't give us an error. Again, Swig says, I can't find it. I'm not going to give you an error on this thing. But let's get our categories. So how do we end up doing this? Well, we've got, and again, right now we've got this in one file. We'll start to separate it out a little bit. But before we do that, let's build this out a little bit. So what we really want to do here, now again, I could do this. Category is equal to data 0. That's not really what I want to do. This will just give me the sports at this point, but it'll give me something, right? So instead of doing that, what I want to do is I'm going to have some method called get category, and I'm going to pass in request params ID. Now, the parameters come in as strings, okay? And I want to sort of coerce that into an integer. So one way to do that would be to multiply it by 1. Now, right now, if I went to run this, okay, I'll get this error message, get category doesn't exist, and let's create that. So we'll have this const get category. This is going to get passed an ID. And we're going to be kind of optimistic with this. We'll say return data. We're going to filter our data. Our data is really our categories, and we're going to filter it. Each of these is a category, and the ones that we want is where the ID is equal to the ID that's passed in. That'll give you an array. I only want one of those. And so now I've got my get category. And so this is games, and this is sports.
Okay.
Okay?
So when we go back to the code, there's one line that I'm not fully understanding. Res.render, okay, categories, category, I get that. Now, what is in the brackets next to that? How is it categories equals data? What is that?
So this is, so you remember before when we wanted to pass something down to the template, when we first started out, we just said foo is equal to bar.
Okay.
This is just data that's going to go to the template, because the templating engine is going to give us the ability to take this second parameter, which is your data, and take this data. And again, we're doing this on one line, which sometimes makes it a little bit harder to read. But it's basically going to take this data and marry it up with the index.html. It's going to take this data and marry it up with the categories.
I see. So that is where the title of the page is coming from.
Right.
And then...
And in fact, we don't have a title here.
You can just put a bunch of data and separate it with commas.
That's exactly right. All it is an object.
Okay.
All it is an object. In fact, you bring up a good point. Why don't we actually do a title here? And this title is going to be, and why don't we just make our title get category. It's a little bit redundant here, but why don't we just make our title the name of the category? Not that efficient, but I just have it on one line. Let's just see what that gets us. So we've got home, categories, sports, categories,
cool.
Games. And just for the sake of argument, let's go in, not the sake of argument, let's actually go in here and put in a backlink. So we'll go over here and we'll just put /categories, all categories.
Okay.
Again, we don't have very good styling, but at least, and that's probably a misspelling, I hope. Categories can't get. I think I have an extra. I'm missing a quote here. So it actually thinks the route is categories with an apostrophe. So here's a category, and then I could always go back.
So in the code in server.js.
Yeah, and this is really where the sort of meat of this thing is.
Category, that's just an example of functional programming right there. So category in category.id is, that's going to be useful for any category that you're working with, either sports or video games.
Yeah, look, the way that I would sort of look at it, I don't know whether or not there's different definitions for functional programming, but what this is basically just some method that, again, if this was a database, I'd be making a database call, and I'd have the ID, and I'd want the category. My database is all inline here. It's in memory.
Okay.
So there's nothing asynchronous that's going on here, but I just want to get this data, and I want to filter it by the ID to get the value back.
Okay.
So now that we have this, look, if you're building this, one thing you might want to do, get.status, get.add, not a great commit message, but we'll take it. And once we do this, we might look at this and say, hey, it'd be nice if I sort of separated this out. So maybe to have something where I could break out all the category stuff into its own separate router, which would allow me to do something like this. And then I can do a require, and let's just say I have my routes in a different folder, routes/categories. Now this doesn't exist yet, but I'm going to create it, okay? If I go to run this now, I'll get a error message that says that it can't find this module because it doesn't exist. And I'll go back over here, and I'm going to modify this, and I'm going to create a routes file, and I'll add categories.js. Now, that'll solve one issue, but the fact is that when I say app.use, it's actually looking for something it could hang its hat on. It's looking for either a middleware function that looks like this, or it's looking for another router which I could end up using. So let's set up that router. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this code, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go into my routes, and I'm going to paste this in here. And I could break it up a little bit. Let's break it up. It might be a little bit hard to read. So this I'm sort of doing as these one-liner ES6 things. Nothing prevents us from making it a little bit more readable. And you might think, this maybe looks a little bit easier to read.
So it's throwing all the category data.
Yeah,
categories, but you'll use only some of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to have some issues here when I go to do this, and we'll talk about what those issues are.
Okay.
But again, we might like the idea of just sort of putting this stuff on, different lines here. In fact, if we do something like this, this would give us the ability to say something like category equals, get category request params.id times 1, in which case we'd have a lot less code here because we could just say title equals category.name. And
so that's actually producing more code, not less code. But what it does is make it more legible.
More legible, and in the end, it probably is less code.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So and I could even use some ES6 syntax here because category is what I'm passing here. So this will actually create the key of category as well. This is the equivalent of this.
ES6.
Okay. Now I'm going to run into all kinds of issues here. There's a number of issues I'm going to run into, and this is one where there are a couple of lines that you have to write before you do it. But don't forget, we did a git commit. We could always back out of this if we want to pretty easily. What we're going to do here is I'm going to say const app equals require express router. So this is not an express app. This is a router. But what it gives me the ability to do is I could put routes on this. Now, don't forget, we have the slash categories in the other file. So I could take this off. I'm basically isolating these routes.
Oh, because this is in categories.js.
That's exactly right. And well, it's not that it's in categories.js. It's the way that I'm accessing it in the server.js. Now I could say, you always have to remember, module.exports equals...
There's an apostrophe missing on line 9.
On line 9.
Before slash ID. App.get, right here.
Oh, thank you. So if I do that, let's just see. So this looks like it's okay. Okay? But if I go back here and I look at this page, I'll get an error because what I ended up doing here is I'm now looking for this data, which doesn't exist in this file, which is on this server file. And at this point, what we can do is let's take this code over here. Let's take it and let's create sort of a faux database by going over here and we'll say const db equals require /db. And over here, when we call categories, we'll say categories equals, and we'll call db get categories. Again, if this were a database, this would be asynchronous. Now, again, this doesn't exist yet. So, again, we get some errors here. It can't find db. But if we go back here and we modify this and we put in db.js, and I just paste what I had before, what I could end up doing here is I could say const get categories. And this is basically just going to be a function that ends up returning my data. So when I want a category, I'm going to do this. Now, don't forget, once I do that, I've got to go and I've got to module.exports. Again, I'm just worried about my get functionality here. This has to be able to get a category and get categories. So now, once I end up doing that, this should end up running. My home page probably will work. So my home page works, but once I go here, I'm going to get that data is not defined. And all I need to do here, so what did I do? I pulled out common functionality that I'm using on those two, in those two modules. And I pulled that out, and I have it now in its own place where really it belongs anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could start things off by having them in the same file, but just realize you could use this, common JS pattern to move them somewhere else, so that these things are great. We want to be able to share them. So we want to bring our DB in. Now, don't forget, we're down one level. So I've got to go back up and get DB. And instead of data, DB get categories. This should actually get this to work.
Right.
But this will be broken because it's not really get category, it's DB.
So I want to ask you a question, and I don't know if I'm using the right terminology. Correct me if I'm wrong. But routes are essentially like the plumbing of accessing data from different locations.
It depends. I mean, routes basically mean, when you think about routes, think about, we have an Express application. So in an Express application, a user is interacting with your server. Routes are the paths that they get to interact with. Okay?
The server.
With the server.
Yes.
So routes are the way that a end user communicates with this HTTP server. It's they're the endpoints that you could end up hitting.
Okay. So those are what routes are. Now, why is router spelled like that? I mean, why is it a router?
I mean, this is just what this allows Express to do.
Switch points.
It's basically saying to Express, hey, look, it's allowing you to combine a set of routes together. And so the way that I always like to think about it is that when I look at this server file, I want to correct one thing here, because also I've got data here. Let's just get this working, and then we'll talk about that. This is going to be db get categories.
Okay.
And so now I've got sports, all, games, and I'm here. And so the way to sort of think about it, the way that I like to think about it, is that when I see this line of code, the way that I think about it is I'm mounting on the path category. If someone comes in with a route of /categories, what Express is going to do is going to see, hey, look, is there a matching route? Anything following the /categories, is there a matching route here? So if you come in with just /categories, Express says, okay, /categories, it gets rid of that. It says, well, what I'm left with is / and it uses this route. If you come in with /categories and an ID, it ends up going here. Again, it depends. Look, we could mount this any way we want to. Just as a silly example, I'm going to do this. This doesn't make any sense, but I just want to show you something. If I call that fizz, I'm not going to break anything. Everything's going to work the same. But if I want to, why I would want to do this, I don't know. But this will also work. And, that'll also work. Of course, when I go back, right, it's going to go back to categories. Just to show you. I mean, this is totally, you could mount this on whatever you want to mount it to. Doesn't make sense, but just to sort of show you, I don't have to name this categories if I don't want to. I'm naming it because it's a logical name for this. Now, once we end up getting that set up, let's actually just think about how we could go about. Let's try to keep this somewhat simplistic here. Let's start out with the idea of when we're on a specific category, we might want to add a product to that category. So we're talking about the inserting route. So this is the equivalent of going here and going down to sports and going here and saying, basketball. We want to be able to save that and see basketball. So I'm going to start to set up that functionality. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to go to the page where I want to do that, which is going to be on my category page. And up here, first of all, let's actually show the products, which we're not doing yet. So let's do that first. So now we're on an individual category page. And then we'll do a for product in category.products. And we'll go over here. And I'm just going to, at this point, show a list and show product.name. So now I've got my tennis racket and golf club, and if I go to games, I don't have anything, okay? So let's set it up so that we could add something here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a form in, and my method is going to be a post because I want to send data to the server. And my action is that I want to actually create a product. And I want to create that product underneath categories. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say categories, category ID. So in the world of RESTful routing, what this route is indicative of, it's a post to categories, an individual category, and I'm going to be looking for this route that doesn't exist yet to go and create a product. And I'm going to go over here, and I'm just going to put in a div. I'll put a label here. And I'll put an input. And I'll give this a name of name because this is my product name. And I'm also going to go and I'll put a button where the type is going to be submit. And I'll give this I'll call this, I'll say save. Now, so what this is going to do is that I could go over here, and if I call this route doesn't exist. Now I'm going to create this route, but don't forget, if I create it underneath my router, I just need the ID and the products. Okay? So what I'm going to do here.
How is it that that button took you there?
Well, because the button took me there because this is basically just using, when you have a form and you do a post.
I see. Action.
Right.
That makes sense.
It's the action that takes me there. If you don't do an action, this would have done a post right back to categories. But I don't want to post back to categories because I'm not creating a category here. I'm creating a product underneath this category. Yeah. So if I go over here, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start setting up this route. And the way that I'm going to do this is going to be app.get ID. This is going to be, /ID products, right? And just to see if that works, we'll do this on multiple lines. Just to see, I want to get rid of that error. I'll say response.send hello. Categories 3, products, and it's not a get, right? This is going to be a post.
Okay.
So I end up getting hello. Now, what I really want to do is I want to see that I could send my data back. So I'm going to look at request.body, which is basically what I'm trying to send here. So you could look, if you use your dev tools here, you could look and see, if I look into my network tab, and I go and I click on save here, if I go back to my network tab, I could see that I'm posting to products, and I could see my data. But if I look at what I end up getting back, I get back nothing. The reason I don't get back anything is that I don't have my body parser set up. So I say npm install body parser. And I'm going to go back, and this is something that should be configured. This is something you're going to want to use for your application. So here, after I define express, I could say app.use, and I could do this really in a one-liner. I could say require body parser, and there's different ways that the body could end up coming in. The one that I want to use is URL encoded body parser, and it'll bark at me if I don't put in extended equals false. This would have to do what this has to do with is if you have some sort of nested relationship inside this, and we don't have it, so we don't need the extended version of body parsing. And now, just with this change, if I go back here and I do that, I'll see that I will get this. And so what that allows me to do here, really simply, is when I end up going back here, instead of actually not doing anything with the body, what I want to do is I want to have that product. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, DB, I'm going to have some method insert product. And I'm going to pass in request params.id ×1, so it could find the category that it needs. And then I'll just pass in the request.body. Now, once I'm done with this, and I'm done inserting, what you want to do is once you end up changing things, the pattern that ends up getting used is a response and a redirect. And I'm going to go back to categories, and I want to see that particular category. Let me actually use my backticks. And this is going to be categories, and this is going to be $ request params.id. Now again, I'm never going to make it this far because I don't have an insert product. So if I try to do this again, it'll say insert product. Doesn't work. And so let's go back and set this up. So insert product, what's that going to look like? Well, we could say const insert product. What are we passing in? This is going to be the ID of the category, and this is going to be the product. So the only thing tricky here is that we actually want to have a valid ID for our product. I mean, we could do this. We could say const category equals get category. And if we end up doing that, we could end up passing in get category ID. But we also want to find an ID for our product. So if I was going to use this, I want to find the max ID for my products. Let me just give you an example of what would happen if I just did this and I said category.push product. That would work, okay? And what I'm forgetting to do, I always do this, is that I need to export that, okay? Category.push, because it's not category push, it's category products push, okay? So now, under games, I've got this guy, but I want you to notice something. If I go over here to these other, under sports, and I look at this, just to sort of show you something, under my views, if I look at the individual category, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to look at the ID of the product. So in this case, I've got IDs 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And again, every time I restart, I'm going to be back to 0, so I'm going to have nothing under games. Actually, not true. Not true. But notice these don't have IDs. And the reason why it didn't restart is I only changed an HTML file, so my server doesn't end up restarting.
Oh, okay, yeah. Right.
But if I ended up doing this, so if I end up doing this and even just putting this line break here, if I go back here, and now I go back to games, I'll be back to nothing there. Okay?
Oh, just from that line break.
Doesn't matter. The question is, when does your server restart? The way that NodeMon works, your server restarts only on JavaScript file changes.
Right, right.
So what I want to do here is I want to actually get a valid ID. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say let max equals, and I'll say category.products, and I'm going to use my reduce. And my reduce is I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say, in fact, let me actually just call this max ID, just to be a little bit clearer. So this is going to be my max value that I'm going to pass through here. I'm looping over products. I'm looping over a product. And so when you end up using the reduce, you have to start out with the value. I'm going to start out with the value 0. So reduce basically will reduce a collection to some value. And I'm just going to ask the question here. If the product.id is greater than max, then I'm going to say max equals product ID. And I'm going to return max. So reduce is pretty common. Again, it's kind of beyond the scope of this, but it's something you should really get comfortable using. And once I end up doing that, what I could do is I could say, hey, look, the product's ID equals plus plus max ID. And once I end up doing that, I could go over here, and here's games. So Monopoly.
Cool.
Right? Now, once you have this, then the question is, probably the next thing that I would end up implementing would be the ability to delete the items. We still don't have the ability to add categories, but again, if we know how to add products, then adding categories is not going to be that hard to do. The only one is a little bit tricky, and let's, for the sake of argument, do it just to see if we can test it out, is we want to be able to delete a category. So what we want is to have something like this. If I end up going into my, first of all, let's start it out this way. We want to delete a product. What do we need to delete a product? We really need two things, right? If we want to delete a product, we need the category ID and the product ID, right? And it's actually a real simple thing to do, because if we end up wanting to delete a product, what we could do is we could get our category, right?
Yeah.
And we could say, hey, look, the category products is equal to category products, and we're going to filter you. And real simply, we're going to look at each of you, and we want you if product ID is not equal to you. And that'll end up deleting a product. Now, again, we're going to have to set up a route that's going to end up taking care of deleting that product. So if this is what our delete method looks like, our route is going to look like this. So here we get to add a product. Well, deleting a product is going to be, we want to be able to use delete. And here, I'm now going to call this category ID, products, and I'm just going to call this ID because this is really the thing that we're deleting. And now once we do that, we could tell our DB, hey, look, delete your product. We'll say request params category ID. And again, we want to have it as an integer. And request params.id. And we want to have that as an integer as well. And once we do that, again, we could redirect, right back to the same page that we're on. But let's just use the right parameter here. Now we're calling it category ID. Now the problem that I have is how do I get to this route? Again, let's make sure that this didn't break anything. The problem that you're going to run into, and we'll work with sports to start out with, is that instead of putting this here, I'm going to put a delete button here. So the problem that we're going to run into is that if we look at our category, so right below each of these, I'm going to give myself a little bit of room here. You can't really do this with a hyperlink. Hyperlinks just do GET requests.
Yeah.
So what you could do is you could do a form, okay? The problem is forms only do posts or gets, okay? Now, again, this is my method. My action is going to be whatever that route was. So that action is going to be /categories, category ID, /products, and I'm looping over the product ID.
Okay.
And if I do that, then I could put a button in here, type equals submit, delete, and close off my form. Now, if I do that and I go back here and I try to delete, it's not going to find this route. This is where this method override comes in.
Okay.
What method override does is says, hey, look, just attach onto here. You could call this really whatever you want, but I'm going to set it up so that I put some middleware in there, and if something comes in, and this is just the way that this module works. If something comes in, and I specify _method, instead of it doing a post, it'll look for delete. Now again, this is not going to buy me anything either, because it's not set up yet.
Yeah.
But if I go over here, npm install method override save. And now I go back here, in the same way that I'm using body parser, I could go over here and say app.use require method override, okay? And this just gives me a method, and I could say I want to use this, but I want you to look for a variable called method. And this puts in a piece of middleware, and that middleware will basically say, hey, look, you came in with a post, but you have a value here for method. I'm going to use delete instead. So if I go back here, now cannot read properly, property filter of undefined. So that's a different error message. Let's go back to our DB, and I did category filter. It should be category products filter. And once that's done, I should be able to delete my tennis racket, my golf club.
All right.
Right? And once you could do this, then the exercise of putting in these other routes. I mean, we covered most of this here, the ones that we probably missed. So we can delete a product, we could insert a product. We don't have the insert category and delete category, but those wouldn't be that. It would be the same sort of thing. It would be just these two methods, and then these two routes, and that would really be the end of the ball game.
That's great.
So that, yeah, let's save this, and hopefully some other folks will find it useful.
Sounds good.